So thank you, Scott, for showing up from DC, New York, and various places.
Thank you very much. I've actually never been to this conference before. I was telling Matt that I was up in downtown San Francisco for another conference focused around design automation, so people who are designing chips, which are part of a lot of the products we saw here today. So excited to be here. Thank you.
Yes, this was almost 40 years next year. So, and some people have actually been here every year, which is kind of cool. And we have something like 70% new people. I'm glad you're here. There may be a chance to ask questions if you'd like, but the topic is the Chips for America Act, and what's happened since 2 years ago almost, when President Biden signed the act into law. Billions of dollars to go into actual fabrication of chips in the United States, a big part of it, and then also research. So I'm going to let you just talk about your role at Chips for America and take it from there.
Sure. So my title is such that I often wonder what it means. And so capabilities could mean anything. And I'll explain a little bit about how the research parts of the CHIPS Act fit in with the rest of the Act in a minute. But basically my job is I am part of the National Semiconductor Technology Center, which is a new entity, a national resource for research and development in semiconductors. And basically my job is to figure out all of the things we need to actually execute on the R&D roadmap. So it's probably worth talking a little bit about just what the CHIPS Act is. And I think more people today know what semiconductors and the CHIPS Act are than you might imagine. It's become part of the parlance. Even my mom seems to understand what a chip is these days, which is the first time in my long career that's happened. But if we have a chart, I can sort of explain at a high level just what's inside the CHIPS Act, because I think it's relevant to the discussion we'll have today. So can we get the first chart up? Perfect. So Chips for America, there are three big parts of the CHIPS Act. And maybe before getting into them, just to restate what I think people know, the CHIPS Act is really in response to how critical semiconductors are to everything we do, right? So nothing in our lives happens without chips. They're in everything from a greeting card that plays happy birthday all the way to the most complex systems in the world. So it's really critical for our economic and national security that we have a healthy ecosystem here in the US. And as such, there's three parts, and the biggest part goes directly to the point I just made. So there's 39 billion of the total of 52 billion of the CHIPS Act are for manufacturing incentives. So you can read that as building a new fabrication facility or upgrading an existing fabrication facility. And I think people, if you follow the news, you've seen, I think there's been 11 announcements of initial terms with companies, everything from multi-billions of dollars, companies like Intel, all the way down to just billions. In fact, there was one today of a materials company.
Did you say just millions?
Just millions, yeah. It is kind of an interesting question. 52 billion is a lot of money. But for people familiar with the semiconductor industry, that's really just a drop in the bucket, unfortunately, in terms of how much money gets spent. But anyway, 39 billion, the biggest part goes directly to manufacturing. The next biggest part is 11 billion. That's for research and development in the U.S., and that's where I'm directly involved, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And then there was 2 billion reserved for the Department of Defense. So DoD has unique needs. Unique application set, so a portion of the bill was specifically allocated for them to be able to accelerate how ideas get into defense systems. And undergirding all of this, which we can talk about, are workforce initiatives. So before we even build new facilities, there's already a workforce shortage. So there are something like 3 million people in the ecosystem of semiconductors today who are employed, right? That's people directly employed and people who are part of the supply chain, et cetera. But there's a massive gap. And now if you imagine all these new facilities coming online, that gap gets even bigger. So every one of these programs has a very strong workforce component in terms of how do we develop that next group of people who are going to participate in this ecosystem. If you go to the next page, I'll talk a little bit more about the R&D. I'll drill down. There are 4 big programs that are part of that $11 billion investment as part of R&D. The biggest one is where I'm involved. That's the National Semiconductor Technology Center, NSTC. That is a new consortium that just got stood up over the past few months. And that is really covers the gamut of every part of the semiconductor R&D ecosystem, such that they can support all this new investment and also put the U.S. on a continued path of leadership and innovation in semiconductors. It is operated by a new entity. You can see the logo there of NatCast. NatCast is a new nonprofit organization. They will be actually running the operations of the NSTC. Packaging is just as critical as R&D in semiconductors. So I think the people who put together the legislation very wisely created a program uniquely for packaging. So that's the National Advanced Packaging Manufacturing Program, and APMP is the second part of the R&D programs. And then there's two others which are relatively smaller. A new Manufacturing USA Institute focused around digital twins. I've heard that term several times already today. And the last part around metrology, or measurement science. And given that the Chips for America team sits as part of NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, that's very much in the DNA of NIST. So how do you do measurements? Everything's getting smaller, more complex, so metrology is really critical. And of course, as I mentioned, undergirding all of that is workforce. So long-winded answer, perhaps, but
No. I've been a government reporter for a long time, and also now a tech reporter. But yes, I've always learned that you need your little pocketbook of acronyms and abbreviations. Even worse than the semiconductor industry. So, are you over all those 4 blocks? Where do you sit in that mired area?
Yeah. So I'm all the way on, I guess, the left, under the NSTC. So you can imagine that two big parts of a national R&D entity would be, number one would be research programs. So what is the NSTC going to fund in terms of research? And then the other half of the coin, which is actually my job, which is, given what research do you want to do, what capabilities do you need to execute that R&D? So that's, where would we do prototyping? What sort of facilities would we use? Should we own our own facilities, or should we not? How do we connect with other capabilities throughout the US? How do we work with commercial foundries? All of those things, obviously under my purview.
And we're at the beginning of that.
We're at the beginning. So the incentives program that we showed, the $39 billion, has been moving very strongly for about a year, let's call it. Very well developed program. So they're just, they're moving along. The R&D programs you're seeing here really are just starting to accelerate over the past 6 to 8 months, I would say. So we're about 9 months behind the incentives program. And part of that is the Department of Commerce. This is a lot of money, right, for the Department of Commerce. It's new in terms of just the scale of investment and that size of a program. Certainly other parts of the government, like the Department of Defense, has a very long history of doing large programs.
Yeah.
Commerce does not. So just to give you a sense, Matt, NIST budget, it fluctuates a bit, but it's been historically about $1 billion a year. And now here's one program of $52 billion that they have to manage. So there's staffing, there are processes, et cetera, that they'll have to get in place. And that's part of the reason why the flywheel is just starting to get turning now.
Just to clarify, though, NIST is the Uber authority, and then they're part of Commerce.
Right. So all of this sits under the Department of Commerce. NIST is an agency under the Department of Commerce, and now Chips for America, all these programs technically sit under NIST, although we have our own culture and behaviors. Yes. But I think we didn't want to create a new government entity. That would have taken even longer, so the decision was that we're part of NIST.
You need it, I guess. You need the bureaucracy.
Sure. These are complex programs. One of the guiding principles is, we want to take good care of taxpayer dollars. Yeah. So all of those processes, although I came from industry, which we can talk about more, it can look very frustrating, which it is, but at the same time, I know as a taxpayer, I'm glad that people are being very careful about how they spend their money.
Yeah. What convinced you to take on this role after being in industry for so long?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm new to Commerce. I think this is my 6th month in the Department of Commerce. Prior to that, I was in the semiconductor industry. So for about 30 years or so, from the first internship I took, I won't mention what year that was, all the way to just 6 months ago, I was in semiconductors. So I was a technologist. I was qualified technologies. I worked at many large companies, both in hardware as well as software. And quite frankly, I wasn't looking for a job. The government reached out to me and said, hey, we really need help standing up this program. Will you do it? And just for context like that, before you parse it too much, that sounds a lot like we want you to work really hard for a lot less money. Right? So at first I was like, why on earth would I do that?
Yeah. Well, thank you for your service. I say that to every officer I run into.
Yeah, but seriously, during the conversations, I started to realize how important the program was. As someone who had been in industry and seen what has happened over the decades, for what are good reasons in terms of manufacturing overseas, et cetera, the chance to influence that going forward was extremely attractive. And to be quite frank, I worked with government a lot in industry, and like a lot of people, cynical of government. So part of the thought process was, well, put your money where your mouth is. You want to complain about the government? Well, they're giving you a chance to actually do something different. So that's really why I decided to join.
Well, good for them for finding you. I'm going to jump into something that sort of generalizes about what we see here at the show, and what are the technology trends that you're seeing, and how would the CHIPS Act and these different agencies change that paradigm for the U.S.? This is obviously to help the U.S.
Yeah, that's true, although there's a lot of international equivalents of the CHIPS Act as well. But you're right, the CHIPS Act is for the U.S. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think if we take one that's on everybody's minds, and we see here is artificial intelligence. Right? That might be a good example for people who are familiar with artificial intelligence hardware. So NVIDIA's been in the news, for instance. So I'll use them as an example. If you look at the latest artificial intelligence processor that NVIDIA puts out, and you look what's inside that, it's not just one chip. It's a very complicated mixture of...
They call it a platform.
Yeah, or you might call it a system in a package, right? So inside that NVIDIA chip, and it's the same if you look inside AMD's chip, there are many chips, first of all, that are connected together, right? There is memory, right? So obviously very data intensive applications, so there's high bandwidth memory. So there might be 5, 6, 7 or more chips on a package. And then, as people know, there's a tremendous power consumption challenge with artificial intelligence. So all the chips on that package, you have to get the heat out. And of course, if you see the heat sinks on one of these things, very large, fans. So that's really a very complicated system. So if I just use the example of what I see on this chart here, the base technology of the chip itself, which is typically in a very advanced node technology, right? Certainly NSTC, you can imagine doing research on new device architectures, new circuit architectures that improve how you do AI. We talked about packaging, right? So you have many chips on one of these boards, how they get packaged, how you deal with thermal effects, warpage, heat, reliability of the components would fit very naturally in the packaging research program. And then, certainly from a measurement perspective, very direct correlation to the sort of things that program would do. You're dealing with single nanometers, often atoms make a difference in terms of these devices. And then, very interesting from a digital twin perspective, which is what the Manufacturing USA program is. I think, as everyone knows, semiconductors are very expensive, right?
Right.
So if you had a digital analog of your architecture, AI, and you could do experiments in that digital domain instead of having to go spend money and go to TSMC or wherever you're manufacturing it, that would be a much faster way to iterate.
So using AI in the production of chips.
Yeah, it kind of feeds on itself.
Yeah, that's great though. That's ideal. So what do you foresee that research could also lead to new materials for chips, and packaging will change. It looks pretty obvious, or could change. I mean, is it more than just using AI to direct the design? Sounds like it is.
Yeah, I mean that's a good sort of broad question about like what specifically is going to go on here. So one of the challenges that we face, and we've heard a lot from the industry, and probably relevant to a lot of people here, is going back to the cost and accessibility questions. So for instance, if you're a startup, or you're someone at university, or you're just someone with a good idea, if that idea is in software, it's very straightforward. Software is very inexpensive. You can go ahead and develop your idea. You'll probably find venture capital money, right? Because it's not capital intensive. If you want to do hardware, then it's a very different story. And in fact, if you look at the trend, Matt, of hardware startups and semiconductors, it's basically flat to declining for the past 10 years. And the reason for that is it's very expensive, right? So if I want to design a chip and I want to go manufacture it, first I have to get someone who's going to give me the time of day, right? Because you're running a high volume foundry, okay, do I really want to deal with your prototype chip? And then it's very costly. So a lot of the emphasis behind these programs is to give ideas, companies, and university research a place to make that transition between the idea and manufacturing. So, very relevant to what I'm working on is how can you do prototyping better, right? So can we lower the barriers to access for people who need to do hardware? How do we give them, design tools at the national level? How do we take advantage of the cloud to do that? How do we, get their hardware design into a facility without them having to go beg for access through a high volume fab? So all of these sort of lower the burden of design, lower the burden of access, and lower cost, we think is one of the things that's going to change how innovation happens in the U.S. to a much faster pace.
How do we get the best ideas from the private industry?
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned, on the NSTC side, that's a consortium, right? So its mission in life is just that. So over the next few months, there'll be a membership drive. As I mentioned, this is a new entity, so the consortium was just stood up in February. There'll be a membership drive over the next few weeks, and by the fall, there'll be members of the NSTC, and they'll have technical advisory boards. They'll have other methods of interacting with people like you. Both NatCast and the CHIPS office have websites and newsletters, right? So there's ways to participate.
800 number?
Not quite 800 number, but natcast.org and chips.gov. Right, there's a way to sign up, so there's a way to actually get your voice heard, and you'll definitely be able to give your good ideas directly to the right people.
Since semiconductors are made everywhere, especially in a little town called Taiwan, how can we take advantage of that while also not looking like an evil empire that's only worried about itself and defending itself and so forth?
Yeah, so semiconductors is a global ecosystem, right? The CHIPS Act is in response to certain aspects of that ecosystem, notably manufacturing, right? So the good news is, the U.S. is still the leader in terms of innovation. U.S. domiciled companies, you can name lots of them. You're familiar with them: AMD, Qualcomm, and millions of small companies, right? Those are U.S. companies, designing chips and selling them. It just so happens that manufacturing is overseas, right? So that's what we're trying to address. But more broadly, we want the best ideas, right? And in fact, if you look at the manufacturing incentives, it's not just U.S. companies, right? So there are multi-billion initial terms with TSMC.
They got a big gift.
They got a big.
You don't call
gift
it a
is the
gift.
right word. I wouldn't call it a gift.
Well, they have to produce certain standards.
Right.
That's right.
But it has to be in the U.S., right? So they're building fabs in Arizona, for instance. Samsung, right, in Texas, right? Another really important company for the ecosystem, right? So we're taking a broader view from an incentives perspective. From a research perspective, similar story. We want good ideas from all over. Now, there's probably a couple of cases where there's countries who are adversaries that we don't want to involve ourselves with, but that's a very small list. But the intent is that there'll be participation in all of these research programs. We just want to keep an eye, again, going back to being good stewards of taxpayer dollars, that the end result of those benefit the U.S. in some way. So, an eye will be taken to, the end result of these things, how does that help the U.S. ecosystem? But we're not saying, we can't do some of that work overseas. We just need to make sure that, some of it is done.
Would your programs be as far-reaching as how are we going to get more PhDs with math backgrounds? Because, everybody talks about how the Chinese have produced more math PhDs than, by far, than us, than the U.S. I didn't mean to say us.
Yeah, we talk about workforce as really critical to all of the CHIPS Act initiatives. And one of the things for people who are involved in workforce, that it's very disaggregated. Lots of ideas, lots of people doing things. It's spread out among many different entities, organizations, etc. So the plan is, and we've announced, that there'll be a Workforce Center of Excellence as part of the NSTC program, with news coming on that over the next weeks and months. And the intent there is to be a central location for all of these good ideas to come together.
Good.
And when I say workforce, it spans lots of different things, right? So, there's a shortage of construction workers, right? As much as there's a shortage of PhD scientists. So I think we're going to try to take as broad a view of we can.
Did not know that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we want as much participation in the ecosystem as we can. Certainly, beyond that, there'll be specific programs for the type of people you're talking about. Scientists, etc. And there'll be a lot of emphasis placed on sort of a database view, like what programs are working. Right? So there are an infinite number of things. How do we collect the data on what are the right metrics, which programs are working, and then how do we scale those up, right? So if you have a need for a workforce in your company, your university system, etc., we want you to be able to come to the NSTC and say, look, here are the programs that we're tracking, here are the ones that are really successful, maybe we'll even help you. We'll give you curricula. We'll give you, train the trainer type of activities. So, again, we hope that consolidation will help, and, we're going to take as broad a view as possible across many different programs.
You have to admit that you need the education before you get the education, right? Okay, thank you. How are the CHIPS programs going to produce results sustainable over the long term? And I don't know how much time I have left. I see I'm adding seconds on the clock here.
Sure, that's a great question. So sustainability is, one of the most important things here. As I hinted at, like $52 billion is a lot, don't get me wrong, but, the semiconductor industry is like soon to be $1 trillion industry, right? So we need to be...
About 600 now, right?
Yeah, exactly, heading quickly towards larger numbers. But we want all these programs to be sustainable. So a couple of thoughts. One is on the incentive side. The application process for manufacturing incentives is extremely onerous, and one of the things companies have to describe is just that. Like, how is this investment going to continue after federal funding ends, right? Because you get money and you're expected to build these facilities and upgrade them. So companies submit a business plan. They actually submit a business plan in some cases with their customers and say, look, yep, I'm going to actually use this capacity. Right, so I think on the incentive side, it's very rigorous. On the research side, a couple of thoughts. One is we want to create something that's not me too capability. It's got to be differentiated such that people want to come, and they want to use it, and they want to contribute, and feel that they're getting something out of it. So, we would certainly expect, creation of intellectual property that people can take advantage of from R&D capabilities perspective. We want people to come and use that capability. There's a way to monetize that. And certainly from a consortium perspective, you have members and they're contributing user fees, et cetera. It's a way to leverage those dollars. So sustainability is really something that comes up every day in discussions. It's a big challenge for sure, but I think there's a lot of smart people thinking about it.
It makes me question. I know they've talked about goals, but way back when the senators were talking about this, 2021. Are we saying in 10, 20 years that we will be self-sufficient with 3 nanometer node? Are we doing anything like that anymore?
So There's been specific metrics around leading edge semiconductors, for sure. So, for instance, today all leading edge semiconductors. By leading edge, I mean
Three.
5, 3, 2, 1,
Yeah.
and smaller. They're all made overseas. The prediction in Intel, who just received some preliminary terms, obviously is one of the big companies here in the U.S. that will produce leading edge semiconductors. There are others, but there's a recent analysis done by the Semiconductor Industry Association, supported by Boston Consulting Group, if I remember correctly. They basically looked ahead to 2030 and said we're going to go from 0% of manufacturing of leading edge semiconductors to something like 20% by 2030. So that's a lot of movement.
That's based on the current growth that these companies are.
Correct. That's based on the money that's rolled out and analysis of what new capabilities are going to come online. So that's a clear metric on leading edge. The other thing I'll mention is leading edge isn't everything, right? So the lion's share of technology and a lot of things that go into sensors are more mature nodes.
Or what?
More mature nodes, right? So they're not always 5
20
nanometers.
nanometers.
Could be 28, 65, 45. And there's a concerted effort to make sure that we support companies that are producing those things as well. So we've seen Global Foundries, we've seen BAE, who's a DoD vendor. These are companies that are not doing single nanometer type technology, but they're getting money because of the importance to the ecosystem of all of them.
Yeah, it takes more than one for sure. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. Where are we? I still see 7. I didn't keep my own clock. 2. Okay. Anybody? I'm not seeing any questions. Oh yeah. Please stand up. You can yell it out.
So much idea is necessary for manufacturing outside the US. What's using out to bring those?
So if I understood your question, the question is around IP and how do we get IP here from overseas? Is that your question, roughly? Yeah, I don't know that we would focus on bringing IP over. So I would agree with you that IP generation is critical. I would split that out in a couple of different ways. Certainly the companies that are manufacturing semiconductors, they have their own IP, and of course they work with third parties as well to bring in IP. Part of their commitment to receive money is to make sure that ecosystem is as broad as possible. Because quite frankly, one of the challenges we have in this industry is the same IP is not available everywhere, right? So how do we get a broader ecosystem of IP as part of the manufacturing incentives? And then we hope as part of the R&D that since we're funding research and development here, we expect new IP creation to be part of all of these R&D programs that are here. And that, of course, will remain in the U.S. So I think it'll take time, but I think you're going to see the ecosystem change. And then we probably don't have time to talk about security, but that's the other aspect, right? Is
Huge area.
from a sustainability perspective, we hope that all of these onshore capabilities will be seen as hopefully more secure, and people will be willing to pay for that to a certain extent.
Well, thanks for the question. We're done. We're out of time, but I think you'll be right here. You can answer a question.
Yeah,
or
happy
two.
to stick around for a few minutes.
Thank you, and